The war was over, or at least, that's what America wanted to believe. 10 years after the guns fell silent at Gettysburg, an elderly Union veteran returned to the battlefield. He stood alone among the graves. The cannons were silent. The fields were green again. But he remembered. He remembered the men who had marched beside him, the men who never came home. And as he looked across the quiet battlefield, one question remained. Had the Civil War really ended? To understand that question, we have to go back to the beginning of the end. April 9th, 1865. Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Inside a modest home, two generals faced one another. Union General Ulysses S. Grant and Confederate General Robert E. Lee. For 4 years, their armies had fought across the American South. Now, there was almost nothing left to fight for. Lee's army was exhausted, supplies were running out, and the Confederate cause was collapsing. That morning, Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. The Civil War was effectively over. Outside the McLean house, the reaction was unlike anything America had seen before. Union soldiers embraced. Some laughed, some cried. Others simply sat down, too exhausted to celebrate. After 4 years of war, they could finally go home. But victory came with a terrible price. Across the country, families had lost fathers. Mothers had lost sons. Children had grown up without their parents. And hundreds of thousands of Americans would never see their homes again. The war was ending, but the wounds were only beginning. And then, something extraordinary happened. Across the South, millions of formerly enslaved African Americans were suddenly free. Families that had been separated for years began searching for one another. Parents searched for children. Children searched for parents. People who had spent their entire lives under slavery now had to imagine a future they had never been allowed to choose. Some walked away from plantations with almost nothing, a small bag, a few possessions, perhaps only the clothes they were wearing. But they had something they had never truly possessed before: freedom. And with freedom came a question. What would that freedom actually mean? While the South struggled to recover, Washington was preparing for a new beginning. In March 1865, President Abraham Lincoln stood before the Capitol. The war was still being fought. But Lincoln was already thinking about peace. He spoke to a nation exhausted by bloodshed. He did not call for revenge. Instead, he spoke about rebuilding, about healing, about bringing Americans back together. The Union had survived, but Lincoln understood something important. Winning the war was not the same as rebuilding the country, and America was about to discover just how difficult that would be. Then, everything changed on the night of April 14th, 1865. Lincoln went to Ford's Theater in Washington. Hours later, the president was mortally wounded. By the following morning, Abraham Lincoln was dead. The man who had guided the country through its darkest years was suddenly gone. America had lost its president. Just days after the war had ended, across the nation, people mourned. Church bells rang. Newspapers published extraordinary headlines, and millions wondered what would happen next. Who would lead the country now? Who would decide the future of the defeated South? And who would protect the freedom that the war had created? News traveled quickly. In cities across America, people gathered around newspaper offices waiting for the latest reports. Printing presses worked almost without stopping. Fresh newspapers rolled from the machines. One headline after another carried the shocking news: Lincoln was dead. For a nation already exhausted by war, it was almost impossible to comprehend. The celebrations of victory were replaced by mourning. The country had survived the Civil War, But it entered peace, carrying an enormous sense of uncertainty. And beneath that uncertainty, America remained deeply divided. The Union had won. The Confederacy had surrendered. But 4 years of hatred could not disappear overnight. In the North, many people believed the war had saved the Union. For millions of African Americans, it represented emancipation. In the South, families remembered sons and brothers who had died fighting. Different communities carried different memories, and those memories would eventually become part of a much larger argument. What exactly had the Civil War been about? What should Americans remember? And whose version of the story would survive? The battlefields slowly changed. The smoke disappeared. The soldiers left. Nature began taking the land back. Grass covered trenches. Trees grew over abandoned positions. Cannons began to rust, but the graves remained. At Gettysburg, thousands of men had fallen within only a few days. Now, the battlefield was almost completely silent. Visitors would eventually come here. They would read the names, walk across the fields, and try to imagine the unimaginable. But something else would happen here. Gettysburg would become more than a battlefield. It would become a place where Americans came to decide what the Civil War meant. And that is where our story truly begins. Because wars are fought on battlefields, but they are remembered somewhere else. In newspapers, in books, in classrooms, in monuments, in family stories, and in the memories passed from one generation to another. The Civil War had ended, but America had not yet decided how to remember it. And once a nation begins rewriting its memories, the consequences can last for generations. So the question remains, did the Civil War really end in 1865? Or did another battle begin? One fought not with guns, but with history itself? This is History 3011. And this is the story of the war America never truly stopped remembering. The Reconstruction era had begun. The war was over. But peace was proving harder to build than anyone had imagined. Across the South, railroads lay broken. Buildings stood damaged. Farms struggled to recover. And millions of people were trying to understand what freedom would mean in their everyday lives. For the formerly enslaved, freedom was only the beginning. Families searched for relatives they had not seen in years. Parents tried to build homes of their own. Children entered schools for the first time, and communities began creating churches, businesses, and institutions that slavery had denied them. But rebuilding a life was not easy. The federal government created the Freedmen's Bureau to provide assistance. Its agents distributed food and clothing. They helped establish schools. They offered medical assistance. And they sometimes helped formerly enslaved people navigate a legal system that was still deeply unequal. Across the South, something remarkable was happening. Schoolhouses were opening. Inside them, children sat at wooden desks with books in front of them. For many, learning to read was more than education. It was freedom. It was independence. It was the ability to read a contract, a newspaper, or even a letter from a loved one. Education became one of the most powerful symbols of the new era. But political change was happening too. The United States adopted constitutional amendments that transformed the legal meaning of citizenship. African American men gained voting rights, and in communities across the South, Black Americans began participating in elections and public life on an unprecedented scale. Some were elected to local offices. Others entered state legislatures. A few even reached the United States Congress. For a brief moment, the possibility of a different South seemed real. A South where formerly enslaved people could vote, own property, build schools, and help govern the communities where they lived. But not everyone accepted this new reality. Resistance began to grow. In many places, former Confederates opposed Reconstruction governments. Political violence and intimidation spread. Secret organizations emerged, and ordinary families began living with a new kind of fear. At night, some families locked their doors. Teachers worried about threats. Community leaders faced intimidation. And people who had fought for political rights sometimes found themselves targeted simply for participating in public life. The federal government responded by sending troops into parts of the South. Soldiers patrolled towns, protected polling places, and attempted to enforce federal law. But the presence of troops also created another political conflict. How long should the federal government remain involved in Southern affairs? And how much power should Washington have over the former Confederate states? Those questions divided Americans. In Washington, congressional leaders argued over the future of Reconstruction. Some demanded stronger protections for African American citizens. Others wanted the Southern states to regain control over their own governments. The arguments became increasingly bitter, and while politicians debated, ordinary people continued trying to rebuild their lives. Farmers returned to their fields. Workers searched for employment. Children went to school. Families built homes. Churches became centers of community life. America was changing. But the transformation was fragile. By the 1870s, political support for Reconstruction began to weaken. The country was becoming tired of conflict. Many Northern voters wanted to move on. Economic problems were creating new concerns, and political priorities were shifting. Then, the federal commitment to Reconstruction began to disappear. Troops gradually withdrew. Southern governments regained greater control, and the era of Reconstruction came to an end. But its legacy would remain. The Constitution had changed. Citizenship had changed. Millions of lives had changed. Yet many of the promises of Reconstruction remained unfinished. And as the political struggle faded, another struggle was beginning, a struggle over memory. Former Confederate soldiers began gathering for reunions. They told stories about the men they had lost. They remembered battles. They remembered friendships. And they remembered the war through their own eyes. Soon, those memories began appearing in newspapers, in speeches, in books, and eventually, in monuments. A new interpretation of the Civil War was taking shape, one that would influence how generations of Americans understood the conflict. And once that story entered America's classrooms, its influence would become even harder to escape, because the next battle would not be fought on a battlefield. It would be fought over the story America told itself about the war. The story was beginning to change. Across the South, former Confederate veterans gathered together in reunion halls, cemeteries, and public squares. They were getting older. Many had lost friends during the war. Some carried old photographs in their pockets. Others still wore faded uniforms during memorial ceremonies. They talked about battles. They talked about courage. They talked about the men who never returned. But as these stories were repeated, something else was happening. The war was becoming a memory shaped by the people telling it. Southern newspapers began publishing stories about Confederate soldiers and commanders. Books appeared describing the conflict from Southern perspectives. Speeches praised military courage and sacrifice. And slowly, a particular interpretation of the war began spreading. Later, historians would call it the lost cause narrative. It presented the Confederacy through themes of honor, bravery, states' rights, and loyalty to one's homeland. But there was a major problem. The central role of slavery in causing the conflict could be minimized or pushed into the background. For millions of African Americans, this was not simply a debate about history. It was about their own lives. Their families had experienced slavery. Their communities had experienced emancipation. And now, they were watching the nation decide how that history would be remembered. But memory was changing in another place, too. The classroom. By the late 19th century, children across America were reading history textbooks that presented the Civil War in different ways. A teacher could place a map of the Union and Confederacy on the wall and explain the war through a particular interpretation. Students absorbed those lessons. Then they went home and heard stories from their parents. The history they learned in school and the history they heard at home could be very different. At the same time, monuments began appearing across southern towns. Stone statues rose above public squares. Confederate generals were placed on pedestals. Names were carved into granite. Ceremonies were organized. Crowds gathered. Speakers delivered speeches about the past. For the people who built these monuments, they could represent memory, family, military service, and sacrifice. But for others, they represented something very different. A reminder of slavery. A reminder of a government created to protect that institution. And a reminder that the war's legacy had never been simple. One monument could tell two completely different stories, and those stories depended on who was standing in front of it. Meanwhile, historians were searching through original documents, letters, diaries, military reports, government records, newspapers, personal photographs. Every document offered another piece of the story. And slowly, a difficult question began to emerge. What happens when memory and evidence don't tell exactly the same story? Because history is not only about what happened, it is also about how people choose to remember what happened. A former Confederate soldier might remember the friend who died beside him. An African American family might remember the generations spent under slavery. A Union veteran might remember the struggle to preserve the United States. All of them were remembering the same war, but they were not remembering the same experience, and that difference would follow America into the 20th century. The war was becoming more distant, but its consequences were not disappearing. They were entering classrooms, public squares, museums, family stories, and eventually, a new generation would challenge many of the assumptions that had shaped America's memory for decades. Because nearly 100 years after Appomattox, America would once again be forced to confront the promises of freedom and equality. And this time, the battlefield would not be Gettysburg. It would be the streets of Montgomery, the churches of Birmingham, the bridge at Selma, and the steps of the nation's capital. The 20th century arrived. America was changing faster than ever before. Factories were expanding. Cities were growing. New technologies were transforming everyday life. But beneath that progress, the legacy of the Civil War was still there. For millions of African Americans, the promises of emancipation and citizenship remained incomplete. Across much of the South, segregation shaped everyday life. Schools were separated. Public facilities were separated. Transportation was separated. And the right to vote could be difficult to exercise. The Constitution had changed, but changing the law did not immediately change society. Still, African American communities continued building. They established schools. They built churches. They created businesses. And they developed organizations that would eventually become powerful forces for change. Education became especially important. Inside small rural classrooms, teachers worked with limited resources. Students studied from worn textbooks. Parents sacrificed so their children could learn. Every school represented something larger than a building, It represented the possibility of a different future. Churches became equally important. On Sunday mornings, they were places of worship, but during difficult times, they were also places where communities organized, discussed problems, and encouraged one another. The struggle continued quietly for decades. Then, America began changing again. Cities grew, Black communities became increasingly organized, and a new generation began asking questions that earlier generations had struggled to answer. Why should citizenship mean something different, depending on the color of your skin? Why should the promises of the Constitution apply differently to different Americans? And if the Civil War had ended slavery, why had equality remained so difficult to achieve? By the middle of the 20th century, those questions could no longer be ignored. Then came Montgomery. December 1955, an African-American woman named Rosa Parks boarded a city bus. When she was asked to give up her seat, she refused. Her arrest helped trigger the Montgomery bus boycott. Thousands of people stopped using the city's buses. Instead, they walked. Some walked miles every morning. Others organized carpools. Churches became meeting places. And an emerging young minister began speaking to the community. His name was Martin Luther King, Jr. His message was powerful. The struggle for equality, he argued, could be pursued without hatred, without revenge, without violence. The movement grew. Students joined, workers joined, parents joined. Ordinary people who had never considered themselves activists began taking part. Then, in 1963, hundreds of thousands gathered in Washington. They came from different states, different communities, different backgrounds. But they shared a demand: that America live up to the promises written into its own laws. The civil rights movement was forcing the country to look directly at its past. The Civil War had promised freedom. Reconstruction had promised citizenship. Now, a new generation was demanding that those promises become reality. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. President Lyndon B. Johnson signed it into law. But the struggle continued. In 1965, voting rights became the center of national attention. In Selma, Alabama, peaceful marchers gathered. They wanted something that many Americans today take for granted: the ability to participate fully in their own democracy. When marchers approached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the country watched. Images from Selma reached millions of Americans. The violence and confrontation shocked the nation. And once again, America was forced to confront the distance between its ideals and reality. Later that year, the Voting Rights Act became law. For many Americans, this represented another major step in the unfinished journey that had begun with the Civil War. Freedom, citizenship, voting, equality. The words had appeared in different eras, but the struggle connected them all, and slowly, America began changing. Schools integrated. Public life changed. Political participation expanded, but the story was still not finished, because laws can change quickly, while memories can take generations to change. The Civil War was now more than a century in the past, yet Americans were still arguing about what it meant, what caused it, what did it accomplish, who should be remembered, and how should those memories be preserved. The answers were no longer confined to old battlefields. They were appearing in classrooms, museums, memorials, and public debates. America had changed, but its conversation with the Civil War was far from over. The battlefield is quiet now, but the argument over memory has entered a new era. Today, millions of Americans visit Civil War battlefields every year. They walk across the same fields where soldiers once marched. They stand beside the same stone walls. They look at the same hills, but they see them through modern eyes. Gettysburg is no longer a place of battle. It is a place of remembrance, a classroom without walls. Park rangers explain what happened. Museums preserve the evidence, and visitors try to understand how ordinary Americans became enemies. Inside museums, the war survives in objects: a uniform, a rifle, a letter, a photograph, a diary. Each artifact tells a small part of a much larger story. And sometimes, the smallest objects are the most powerful. A soldier's letter home can reveal fear that never appeared in an official military report. A family photograph can show what a battlefield map never could. A diary can reveal what someone truly believed. Before later generations change the story, that is why historians continue returning to the archives. They examine old newspapers. They compare letters. They study military records. They question assumptions that have been repeated for generations. Because history is not simply something we inherit. It is something we continue to investigate. And that investigation matters. In American classrooms today, students can study the Civil War through multiple sources. They can compare photographs, read personal letters, examine maps, and ask difficult questions. What did people know at the time? What did they believe? What were they afraid of? And whose voice was missing from the historical record? Those questions are important because memory and history are not always the same thing. A family may remember an ancestor as a hero. Another family may remember the same era as a time of oppression. A monument may represent sacrifice to one person and injustice to another. That is why America's Civil War monuments have become part of a much larger national conversation. Some Americans see them as memorials to ancestors and soldiers. Others see them as symbols of a cause that defended slavery. Communities across the country have debated what should remain, what should be moved, and what should be explained with additional historical context. There is no simple answer, because the monuments themselves are part of the history. They tell us not only about the Civil War, but also about the generations that came afterward. They tell us what people wanted future generations to remember, and sometimes, what they wanted future generations to forget. Walk through Arlington National Cemetery, and the meaning of sacrifice becomes even more powerful. Rows of graves stretch across the landscape. Generation after generation of Americans are buried there. Different wars, different eras, different reasons for serving. But the same reminder remains. A nation can survive a war and still carry its consequences for generations. In Washington, the Lincoln Memorial offers another reminder. Abraham Lincoln sits quietly in marble, the president who led the nation through its greatest crisis. Now watches over a country that survived it. Nearby, the United States Capitol rises above the city. It is easy to forget that this building once stood at the center of a nation fighting for its own survival. The Union survived, but survival came at an enormous cost. And perhaps that is why the Civil War still matters. It did not simply decide who would win a war. It changed what it meant to be an American. It changed the Constitution. It ended slavery. It transformed citizenship. And it changed the relationship between the federal government and the states. But its most complicated legacy may be something else. Memory. Because every generation inherits the story, and every generation has the opportunity to ask new questions about it. A letter written by a frightened soldier in 1863 can still speak to someone today. A photograph taken more than a century ago can still make us stop and look. A battlefield covered in grass can still make us wonder what happened there. The people who fought the Civil War are gone, but their decisions remain. Their words remain. Their photographs remain. their consequences remain. Stand at Gettysburg today, and the battlefield looks peaceful. Children walk with their parents. Visitors read historical markers. The wind moves through the grass. There is no gunfire, no smoke, no army waiting beyond the hill. Only silence. But that silence carries a story about freedom, a story about division, a story about sacrifice, and a story about a nation trying to understand itself. The Civil War officially ended in 1865, but America never completely stopped asking what it meant. Was it a war to preserve the Union? A war over slavery? A struggle over states' rights? A conflict over the future of American democracy? The evidence gives us answers. But understanding those answers requires something more than memorizing dates. It requires honesty. It requires curiosity. And it requires the willingness to listen to voices from the past, even when those voices make us uncomfortable. Because history is not supposed to make the past look simple. It is supposed to help us understand it. And perhaps that is the real reason the Civil War still matters. Not because America is still fighting that war, but because every generation must decide what lessons it will carry forward. The battlefield is quiet. The soldiers are gone. The cannons are silent. But the questions remain. And perhaps they always will. The Civil War ended in 1865, but its memory still shapes America. Thank you for watching History 3011. If you enjoyed this journey through American history, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story. Until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and never stop exploring the history that shaped the world.